The death of Moses is often seen as the end of an era, the closing of a chapter filled with miracles, divine encounters, and a relentless pursuit of destiny in the wilderness. But what if I told you that his death wasn't just the conclusion of his life, but the spark that ignited something far greater? The moment Moses took his final breath on Mount Nebo, something extraordinary began to unfold, something that would forever change the course of history. But hold on, it wasn't a quiet, peaceful ending. It was a shocking series of events that would leave you in awe, each one more unexpected than the last. In the span of just a few days, 7 earth-shattering things happened. 7 divine movements that would propel the people of Israel forward in ways no one could have predicted. What were these events, and how did they set the stage for an entirely new generation to rise up? You may be wondering, how does this ancient story relate to your own life today? Could these signs of divine momentum be pointing to something in your life right now? Comment 777 if you're ready to dive deep into the incredible events that followed Moses' death. The journey ahead is one of divine acceleration, mystery, and revelation. So let's step into this powerful story together. The story of how Moses' death led to a new chapter of faith, destiny, and movement like never before. What happened next will leave you in awe. Let's begin. 7 terrifying things that immediately happened when Moses died. The instant Moses drew his last breath, something almost electric swept through the camp of Israel. The atmosphere didn't fall into hushed mourning, nor did it pause in sacred stillness, as one might expect for the death of such a colossal figure. Imagine being there, standing among thousands who had followed Moses through wilderness and war, expecting perhaps the trumpets to sound, or the elders to weep in sackcloth for weeks. Wouldn't you look around for signs of a great national lament, for the kind of royal funeral worthy of a prophet who spoke face to face with God? Yet there was none of that. No official day of grieving was etched into their calendars. No long processions of lamenting priests were recorded. Instead, Scripture captures a moment that stuns the human mind, yet reveals the unwavering pace of heaven. Without a heartbeat's hesitation, God himself breaks the silence. But not to speak to the priesthood, not to gather the elders for counsel, not even to console Aaron's descendants. The Almighty directs his voice straight to Joshua, Moses' longtime aide. Joshua 1:1-2 reveals this breathtaking pivot. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, "Moses, my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel." Can you picture Joshua in that instant? The weight of a nation suddenly placed on his shoulders, the echoes of God's command still swirling in his ears. Was his heart pounding, his knees trembling at the thought of stepping into shoes that seemed far too large for any mortal to fill? This was no accident of circumstance, no hurried election in a moment of crisis. Deuteronomy 34:9 shines a light on the hidden hand of preparation. Now Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. This wasn't a last-minute arrangement. It was the unfolding of a divine succession plan meticulously orchestrated by God over decades. Have you ever wondered how many quiet years Joshua spent training in the shadows, carrying out humble tasks, watching, learning, waiting while destiny simmered beneath the surface? He was there when Moses ascended the smoking heights of Sinai, lingering close enough to feel the trembling earth. He stood guard at the mysterious tent of meeting, protecting the sacred space where glory would descend, like a consuming fire. He was one of the spies who braved the giants of Canaan, yet unlike the others, he refused to let fear rewrite God's promise. Isn't it remarkable how sometimes your fiercest tests become the very proving ground for your future authority? And now, with Moses gone, without ballots or coronations, Joshua stands transformed into Israel's new leader, not by popular vote, but by an act of holy impartation. The mantle that had once rested on Moses slips seamlessly onto Joshua's shoulders. The Bible underscores that this was not merely a human appointment, but a spiritual transference. It was as if the breath that left Moses' lungs had moved into Joshua's, stirring him with supernatural courage. Let that image soak into your spirit. One man breathes his last, another man breathes in destiny, but the purposes of God do not falter or stall. As Ecclesiastes 3:1 reminds us, to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. And Psalm 75:6-7 draws the curtain back on heaven's strategy. For exaltation comes neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south. But God is the judge. He puts down one and exalts another. Doesn't it make you wonder, in your own life, whose shoes might God be preparing you to step into, or whose hands might He be preparing to lift you up when your moment arrives? Could it be that while you're hidden in the shadows, He's shaping you to carry a weight you can't yet imagine? These sacred shifts in leadership weren't relics of an ancient world alone. They echo through time to teach us that God's mission never skips a beat, even when giants fall. Someone rises, not by the clamoring of crowds, but by the quiet decree of heaven. And perhaps, just perhaps, your story is being written in the same mysterious ink. But hold your breath, because what unfolded next, in the wake of Moses' death, were 7 astonishing events that shook Israel to its core, each one revealing a side of God's plan more startling than the last. Shock number 1 comes swifter than the swing of a sword. God does not grant Joshua even a breath to weep. There is no sacred week of black robes, no solemn parade of elders laying wreaths at Moses' resting place on Mount Nebo. Can you sense how startling this is? Not a single tribal council is summoned, not one committee is formed to ease the burden of transition. The entire baton passes, not from human hand to human hand, but from the eternal palm of God Himself directly into Joshua's trembling grasp. And the divine mission marches forward with an urgency that seems almost ruthless to our human hearts. Isaiah 55:11 thunders across this moment. So shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me void. The decrees spoken through Moses had not died with him. They lived, pulsing with unstoppable power, ready to be fulfilled through Joshua's obedient feet. How often do we believe that when a towering spiritual giant falls, whether a beloved pastor, a parent, or a mentor who carried our burdens in prayer, everything must come to a standstill, that perhaps God Himself might pause in deference to our grief. But here's a truth that slices through sentiment like a double-edged blade. The death of God's servant is never the death of God's movement. His plans are not draped in funeral black. They surge ahead, waiting not on our readiness, but on our willingness. Does that strike something deep in you? 2 Timothy 2:2 offers the very blueprint of heaven's strategy. And the things you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. God had been shaping Joshua in private for years, testing his loyalty when no crowds applauded, refining his courage in lonely moments that history never recorded. And now, before the nation's tears had even dried, He was lifting Joshua into a spotlight that would burn through the ages. What followed would not merely ruffle borders, it would shake entire kingdoms. Imagine it for a breath. You're Joshua, still haunted by the echo of your mentor's final words, still feeling the ache of loss pulsing through your chest. Now suddenly, every eye, hundreds of thousands of them, fierce warriors and fragile children alike, turns to you. Over 600,000 men, not counting women or little ones, clinging to their mothers' robes, await your first command, and ahead lies a roaring river at flood stage, a surging wall of water daring you to believe God's promise. Beyond that, hostile nations with iron chariots, fortified cities teeming with seasoned soldiers, descendants of giants who could crush 10 men with a single blow. And then God speaks again. Do you feel how the air must have quivered around Joshua? Joshua 1:3-5 records. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as I said to Moses. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. This is where it veers into the truly shocking. God isn't calling Joshua to manage tents and rations in the wilderness. He is commanding him to lead a conquest, to dismantle nations, topple mighty walls, and face legions who'd been sharpening their swords for generations. Can you fathom the audacity of it? Joshua had never led a single large-scale battle in his life, yet God spoke of victory as though it was already etched into the stone of history. Romans 4:17 whispers of this same wondrous certainty. God, who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did. Isn't it astonishing how heaven talks about your future victories, the territories you haven't yet stepped into, the strongholds you haven't yet toppled, as if they're already yours? Could it be that right now, while you're still trembling, God is speaking promises over your life that only your footsteps can unlock? Shock number 2 breaks like a thunderclap over Joshua's life. God hands him a divine assignment that no mortal could ever shoulder alone. Yet notice something profound. Before offering blueprints or detailed strategies, God gives Joshua something infinitely more important. He gives him his presence. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. That single promise was the key that would unlock every gate, silence every fear, and topple every wall. Can you imagine hearing those words spoken over your trembling heart? Exodus 33:14 echoes this very heartbeat of heaven. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. This wasn't simply a kind reassurance to calm Joshua's nerves. It was a transfer of covenant authority. The very same divine companionship that split seas and brought down plagues upon Egypt was now pledging to walk with Joshua into every dark valley and every battlefield. But here's where the staggering reality comes crashing in. Jericho was not sitting vacant with welcome mats at its gates. The land of Canaan was no passive prize waiting politely for Israel to claim it. Picture towering walls fortified for centuries, fierce warriors born of the bloodline of giants, descendants of Anak who dwarfed ordinary men, their very shadows sending tremors through human hearts. There were kings who had long prepared for war, alliances forged in iron and stone. And Joshua? He wasn't raised on war councils or trained with the tactics of generals. He was the humble guardian of Moses' tent, a servant accustomed to quiet watchfulness rather than trumpeting commands. Zechariah 4:6 slices through every illusion of human adequacy. Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts. And so does God's personal commission to Joshua. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Joshua 1:9. Doesn't this strike close to home? How often have you felt the whisper of God's call nudging you towards something breathtakingly bigger than your skills, your confidence, or your credentials? The mission He lays upon you might look outrageously beyond your capacity. You might stand there, hands trembling, heart racing, whispering, "Who am I to do this?" But look at what God reveals. He never once demanded Joshua feel qualified or seasoned. The only question heaven seemed to ask was whether Joshua trusted that God would go before him. 1 Thessalonians 5:24 declares, "The one who calls you is faithful, and He will do it." Could it be the same for you right now? That the impossible task ahead is simply a stage set to showcase God's astonishing faithfulness through your fragile obedience? And here's a sacred pattern etched into eternity. When a leader breathes his last, God's purposes do not expire. When a mentor who once steadied your wavering steps departs, the mission does not dissolve into the dust. In fact, sometimes your humble obedience becomes the living continuation of promises God first whispered to someone else. Joshua's life blazes with this lesson. God calls you into territories you cannot conquer alone, not to see you crushed under their weight, but so that His power might explode through your yielded life. Ephesians 3:20 rings out like a song over this truth. Now, to Him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly, above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. You'd almost brace yourself for rebellion, wouldn't you? Moses hadn't merely led Israel. He had stood as the very mouthpiece of God, the thunder atop Sinai, the lone figure who faced Pharaoh armed with nothing but a staff and heaven's backing. This was the same man who had interceded when God's wrath threatened to consume Israel, shielding them like a living wall of mercy. And now Moses was gone, leaving behind only the dust of his footprints on distant mountains. In his place stood Joshua, faithful, yes, but always second in command, always the assistant trailing quietly behind the great prophet. Wouldn't you expect the people to hesitate, to murmur in secret tents that Joshua was too small for such a monumental role? Yet, what happened next is one of the most shocking and unexpectedly beautiful turns in Israel's story. The very people who had once rebelled against Moses so often now turn to Joshua with hearts strangely unified. Joshua 1:16-18 records their pledge. "All that you command us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we heeded Moses in all things, so we will heed you. Only the Lord your God be with you, as He was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your command shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous." Can you see it? The same God who orchestrated every plague in Egypt was now orchestrating human hearts, knitting them together in loyalty under a new shepherd. And doesn't it make you wonder, in the chapters of your life that seem most unlikely, could God be preparing the hearts of others to rally around the very calling He's about to reveal through you? Shock number 3 unfolds with a force that might make even seasoned hearts shudder. The Israelites didn't merely accept Joshua's leadership. They bound themselves to it with an iron vow, pledging absolute loyalty and sealing that allegiance under the sobering threat of death for any who rebelled. This wasn't the casual agreement of polite churchgoers murmuring "Amen" under their breath. This was a generation forged in the brutal furnace of consequence, a people who had witnessed firsthand the high cost of defiance. Can you imagine the weight of memory that hung over their campfires at night? They had grown up watching their fathers and mothers slowly die in the wilderness, skeletons of dreams scattered across barren sands, all because of stubborn unbelief and grumbling hearts. They could still recall the haunting tales of Korah's rebellion, the moment the very earth yawned open and swallowed him alive, closing again over howls of terror. This was not a bedtime story. It was a family tragedy burned into their collective soul. Numbers 32:11-13 records God's chilling decree, "Surely none of the men who came up from Egypt shall see the land. because they have not wholly followed me." So the Lord's anger was aroused, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years. This new generation had learned the lesson their parents could not stomach. They carried the scars of history in their hearts, understanding that delayed obedience was still disobedience, and disobedience always extracted a dreadful price. So now, standing on the threshold of promise, they rose with a fierce resolve. No more hesitation, no more testing God's patience, no more wandering circles around wasted years. Isn't there something profoundly humbling in that? How many of us have wandered our own spiritual deserts far longer than necessary because our hearts refused to trust completely, because unity felt too costly or submission too humbling? Notice how astonishingly different Joshua's experience was from so many modern tales of leadership. He didn't have to charm the people with silver-tongued speeches or win their hearts by clever persuasion. He didn't canvass tents, begging for votes. There was a holy urgency that united them far beyond personality. They had a desperate hunger not to repeat history's tragedy. Hebrews 3:19 cuts to the heart of it. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. They were determined that this time they would not fall short. Hebrews 13:17 also sets the divine pattern straight. Obey those who rule over you, and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls. Let them do so with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you. God's kingdom has never been a democracy. It is a theocracy, ruled by divine will, and when God chooses to funnel his plans through appointed leaders, he expects the people to honor that alignment. Not because leaders are flawless, not because blind loyalty is ever holy, but because divine order is the conduit through which God's purposes flow into earth's tangled affairs. There is a sacred difference between idolatrous devotion to a man and biblical unity around God's moving hand. Does it stir something uncomfortable in you? Are you willing to stand under godly leadership even when it chafes your pride or challenges your preferences? Could your breakthrough be waiting just beyond a line of obedience you've been hesitant to cross? 1 Corinthians 1:10 pleads, "Now I plead with you, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment." The wilderness had taught Israel exactly what disobedience cost. Now they were prepared to follow, even to the point of death, if it meant finally stepping into the land promised to Abraham so long ago. And just when you might think God's wonders had retired with Moses, the narrative throws open a scene that stuns the senses. You remember the Red Sea, don't you? That unforgettable hour when Moses lifted his staff and God split the waters in two towering walls, dry seabed stretching out like a divine highway beneath Israel's trembling feet. Surely such drama had been reserved for Moses alone, right? Think again, because Moses may have been gathered to his ancestors, but God was far from finished making headlines. In Joshua 3:15-17, as the priests carrying the ark tiptoed into the raging floodwaters of the Jordan, swollen far beyond its banks during harvest, something utterly miraculous happened. The waters obeyed heaven's silent command, piling up in a distant heap, leaving a path of dry ground wide enough for an entire nation to cross. Imagine standing there, watching the river you thought would drown you suddenly bow low in surrender to the God who rules land and sea alike. Doesn't it make you wonder what rivers might still part under your own feet if you dared to step forward in raw trust, unshaken unity, and fearless obedience? Shock number 4 pulses with divine déjà vu. The Jordan River split wide open. Dry ground appeared once more beneath the feet of an entire nation, just as it had decades earlier at the Red Sea. But don't let the familiarity of the miracle dull its staggering force. This was not a poetic picture meant to inspire songs around future campfires. It was a raw, undeniable, supernatural breach of natural law, heaven itself ripping open the normal flow of rivers to make a point that no human heart could ignore. Why did God do it? Was it mere spectacle to keep a restless people entertained? Far from it. This was no stage show of divine theatrics. This miracle was God's solemn signature scrawled across history, a silent yet thunderous declaration that Joshua was his chosen vessel. Joshua 4:14 records it with haunting clarity. On that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they had feared Moses all the days of his life. Isn't that incredible? In one moment, without a single human vote or coronation ceremony, God established Joshua's legitimacy in a way no council of elders, no lineage or pedigree could ever manufacture. This wasn't about family trees or impressive resumes. Joshua had never stood before a burning bush. He hadn't marched into palaces to demand plagues. No divine thunder had enveloped him on Sinai. Yet with a simple parting of water, God whispered across an entire nation, "This is my man. Follow him." Imagine standing there at the edge of the Jordan, toes curled over muddy banks, eyes wide with hope and terror. Your parents had told you stories of a sea that once peeled back in the east, and now here you were, seeing a river part in the west, right at the doorstep of your inheritance. Doesn't that stir something deep inside, wondering how God might be setting up similar moments of public confirmation in your own life? It's important to grasp that this miracle wasn't ultimately about the crossing, it was about the endorsement. Mark 16:20 reveals the timeless pattern, and they went out and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them and confirming the word through accompanying signs. God was validating Joshua before the eyes of all Israel, placing a seal upon him that no enemy could deny. But catch this subtle, often overlooked truth. God didn't split the Jordan first and then invite them to stroll across. He waited, intentionally, for a terrifying, trembling step of faith. Joshua 3:13 spells it out. As soon as the soles of the feet of the priests rest in the waters shall be cut off. The river only yielded to those who dared to step into its flooding current with the ark of God's presence on their shoulders. This was obedience before evidence, faith that walked forward long before the miracle revealed itself. Doesn't that probe at your own heart? How many times have you waited for rivers to part before daring to move, demanding certainty before commitment? Hebrews 11:6 reminds us, without faith it is impossible to please him. The Jordan didn't split for cautious spectators standing safely on the banks. It split for believers who risked soaking their ankles in rushing currents while trusting God's invisible promise. God still proves his chosen today, not by polished speeches, social influence, or self-declared anointing. 2 Corinthians 10:18 says it outright, "For not he who commends himself is approved, but whom the Lord commends." Divine legitimacy comes from heaven's hand, and sometimes God holds back his supernatural confirmation until you take that trembling first step. So don't miss the deeper wonder. The same God who had once split seas for Moses was now splitting rivers for Joshua. The message rang clear through every splash and swirling current. God's presence doesn't perish with a prophet. His power isn't buried in tombs. It continues, ever seeking willing vessels through whom he might astonish the earth once again. And just when you might think the hardest stretch was behind them, that the parted Jordan and stacked stones of remembrance on its banks marked the climax, the story pivots into a breathtaking realm that redefines everything. It wasn't a military council or a clandestine war briefing that came next. It wasn't hours spent drawing up battle lines on dusty maps. Instead, Joshua found himself face to face with the invisible world. Joshua 5:13-15 sets the stage with eerie power. "And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" So he said, "No, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped. Can you picture it? The sun sinking low behind Jericho's looming walls, the scent of battle thick in the air, when suddenly eternity stands before Joshua in warrior form. Doesn't it make you wonder how many encounters with the divine might await just beyond the edge of your obedience, where strategy falls silent and only worship remains? Shock number 5 breaks across Joshua's world with the brilliance of lightning splitting a midnight sky. God sends a heavenly commander, not to stand with Israel, not even to simply bless their side, but to take command of the entire battlefield himself. Picture this. Joshua had just finished surveying the looming fortress of Jericho, perhaps pacing with heavy thoughts, strategy lines crisscrossing in his mind, fully assuming he was the top general of this historic campaign. And then suddenly there stands a warrior before him, sword drawn, eyes blazing with an authority that could turn stone to dust. Joshua musters the courage to step forward, demanding to know, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" It's a question any of us might have asked. We want to know who's on our side. We crave assurance that God is fighting for our cause. But the reply is enough to drain the blood from human faces. The divine figure answers simply, "No." Not yes, not no, not yours, not theirs. But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. In that shattering instant, Joshua realizes he is not the highest-ranking officer on this field. He's not orchestrating heaven's aid to support his strategy. He's standing before the supreme commander of heaven's hosts, a figure many scholars believe is none other than a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself, the captain of salvation. Exodus 15:3 makes it clear who this commander is. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Doesn't it stir a tremor in your spirit to know that the same gentle shepherd who leads you beside still waters is also a mighty warrior, sword unsheathed, leading legions of angels? This encounter reveals something profoundly unsettling and beautifully humbling. The coming siege of Jericho was never just about crumbling walls and human tactics. It was about aligning Earth's small plans with heaven's colossal agenda. Ephesians 6:12 peels back the veil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. The true clash was always a spiritual collision, where the physical fortress of Jericho was merely a shadow of deeper battles raging in unseen realms. Before Israel ever unsheathed a sword or lifted a battle shout, God thundered his message in absolute clarity. "This isn't your fight, it's mine." Can you let that settle into your soul? 2 Chronicles 20:15 breathes the same divine assurance. "Do not be afraid nor dismayed, for the battle is not yours, but God's." What does this scene whisper to you and me, living so many centuries later? That spiritual victory doesn't begin with iron muscles or sharpened weapons. It starts in a far more vulnerable, counterintuitive place, with surrender. Joshua 5:15 reveals how the divine commander looks at Joshua and says, "Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua falls in obedience, slipping off his sandal, laying down not just leather and strap, but also his pride, his assumptions, and every illusion of control. Could it be that before Jericho's mighty walls could tumble, something even more critical had to collapse first? Joshua's own sense of self-direction had to bow low. The real battleground was holiness. The sharpest weapon was worship. James 4:7 draws the line clearly. Submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Joshua learned that triumph does not flow from carefully crafted human plans. Victory breaks forth from the very presence of the commander. God doesn't stride onto the battlefield to rubber stamp your agenda. He arrives to summon you into alignment with his. And that's precisely where the tide of war turns. Isn't it both comforting and terrifying? When you step into the assignment God has called you to, whether it's a new ministry, a bold act of forgiveness, or a leap into a promise that feels far too large, you can expect resistance. Giants will still stand in your way, and rivers may still rage at your feet. But equally, you should expect heaven's armies to flank your cause, because you've chosen to walk in God's unfolding plan, not merely your own. Romans 8:31 stands as an anthem over such moments. If God is for us, who can be against us? Can you imagine the hush that must have fallen over Joshua's heart in that holy moment? There he was, not the grand orchestrator of Israel's conquest, but a barefoot servant trembling before the living God who had come to lead the charge himself. Doesn't it make you wonder what holy ground you might be tiptoeing across even now? Moments where God doesn't come to endorse your plan, but to invite you to kneel and join his. Shocking number 6 arrives not with crashing thunder or blazing fire, but with a quietness so profound it feels almost unsettling. The manna ceased. That may sound simple, even gentle, but for Israel, it was like waking up in a new universe. They had crossed the Jordan in miraculous style. They had just renewed their covenant through circumcision at Gilgal, recommitting their bodies and hearts to God after decades of wilderness wandering. They stood at last on the soil of promise. The land that had haunted their parents' dreams and filled countless lullabies whispered over tents by anxious mothers. Everything seemed perfectly poised for yet another divine wonder. Surely God would continue the same daily provisions that had carried them this far, right? But then something startling, even jarring, happened. Joshua 5:12 records it in stark simplicity. Then the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten the produce of the land, and the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan that year. Can you picture that morning? The sun creeping over the hills, golden light spilling across thousands of tents, families emerging with baskets, as they had every dawn for 40 years, expecting to see the glistening white flakes scattered like pearls across the ground. But there was nothing. Confusion rippled through the camp. Children's voices called out, men frowned, women stooped low and ran their hands through empty grass. Word spread quickly, tent to tent. There was no more manna. And that's why it was so shocking. For 4 decades, manna had been the daily love letter from heaven, proof that God was still with them. It had required no tilling, no seed buried in anxious hope, no sweat dripping from furrowed brows. Only simple obedience to gather. The dew would lift, and there it was. Heaven's bread, fresh and fragrant, enough for the day. It had kept babies alive and elders strong. It had become as expected as breathing, and now, nothing. No angelic fanfare, no final trumpet blast to declare its conclusion. Just silence. Why? Why would God so suddenly stop what had sustained them so long? The answer lay all around them, quietly whispering from freshly picked figs, glistening grapes and stalks of barley rustling under gentle breezes. They had just tasted the first harvest of Canaan. The land itself was now offering them nourishment. God was signaling a holy transition. This was no longer the season of wilderness survival. This was the season of inheritance, of building, of sowing and reaping, of ruling and reigning in the territory God had sworn to Abraham. Could it be that the absence of manna was not abandonment, but graduation? Doesn't that turn so many of our fears inside out? Hebrews 11:1 tells us, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." For 40 years their faith had been exercised by simply gathering what fell at their feet. Now faith would mature into plows and planting, harvesting and defending. This was not lesser faith. It was deeper, broader, richer. Imagine how many of them panicked that first day. How many cried out in fear that God had left them, forgetting to see the loaded vines and heavy clusters of fruit now hanging within reach. Isn't that how we so often respond? When God ceases to provide in the old way, we tremble, fearing he's gone quiet. But sometimes God stops sending manna, not because he's punishing us, but because he's promoting us. Your wilderness required manna. Your promised land demands maturity. The daily bread that fell like dew was for wanderers, refugees, those in transit. But now they stood as heirs, called to sow into soil that would yield hundredfold. Philippians 4:19 promises, "And my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in glory." Notice, it doesn't promise he'll always do it the same way. His supply might shift forms, moving from morning dew to sun-warmed wheat fields, from miracles you simply gather to harvests you labor for. So don't mistake the absence of manna for the absence of God. Could it be he's saying to you right now, it's time to grow, to dig, to trust me in new ways. I am still providing, just not in yesterday's pattern. Isn't that both unsettling and exhilarating? That you might be standing at the very edge of your next season, where God's silent withdrawal of the old is really the quiet unveiling of something gloriously new. Shocking number 7 pierces deeper than any sword drawn in battle. God ordered a mass circumcision right before war. Try to grasp just how staggering that was. The Israelites had just crossed the Jordan in a miraculous display of power. They were finally standing inside enemy territory, so close to Jericho they could likely see watchmen pacing its towering walls. The people were galvanized, unified by fresh wonders. They had momentum. They carried God's promise in their bones. From any human perspective, this was the perfect moment to strike, to charge swiftly and catch Jericho trembling in uncertainty. But then God issued a command that shattered all expectations and flew in the face of every sane military strategy. Joshua 5:2-3 records it with almost chilling simplicity. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives for yourself and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel. Can you imagine the collective gasp that must have swept through the camp? Soldiers who had just steeled themselves for combat were instead handed over to the surgeon's blade. This wasn't a quiet spiritual retreat. It was a painful physical act that would incapacitate the entire male fighting force for days, leaving them completely exposed. There were no secret reserves, no hidden walls to retreat behind, no cavalry waiting in the shadows. If Jericho's armies had attacked at that moment, Israel would have been slaughtered. Why would God order such a thing right after giving them such miraculous victories? Why deliberately weaken his people at the very doorstep of war? Because this was never just about military conquest. It was about covenant fulfillment. Joshua 5:4-7 uncovers a hidden tragedy. Every male born during the 40 years of wilderness wandering had grown up without receiving the mark of circumcision. They had food from heaven. They had pillars of fire and cloud. They even had victories in small skirmishes. But they didn't yet bear the physical sign of the covenant God made with Abraham, the very foundation of their identity as God's chosen. Before they could take possession of the promise, they had to be marked as belonging to the promiser. Isn't that breathtaking? Before there could be triumph, there first had to be transformation. Before they could conquer foreign kings, they had to consecrate themselves fully to their own king. God was making something abundantly clear to Israel and to every watching realm in heaven and on earth. You do not win because you are strong. You win because you are mine. Zechariah 4:6 proclaims it timelessly. Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts. And Psalm 20 verse 7 sings out across battlefields then and now. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. Imagine being one of those young men lying under makeshift tents, wincing in pain, hearing rumors that Jericho might soon retaliate. Wouldn't doubt try to creep in? Wouldn't fear try to whisper that Joshua had lost his mind? Yet God was doing a sacred surgery, cutting away more than just flesh. Joshua 5:9 reveals the deeper truth. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." This was more than a national rite. It was a cleansing of old shame, a stripping off of the identity of slaves so they could rise up as sons. Isn't that exactly how God still works with us? We cry out for victory, for external enemies to fall, for walls to crumble. But so often God starts by dealing with what's inside us: fears, pride, addictions, wounds, secret rebellions, carving away every fragment of the old so we can truly carry His promise without compromise. And here's the hard, beautiful truth. We often long for victory without the surgery. We want breakthrough without the blade. But God will sometimes halt us in our tracks, asking us to lay down all illusions of strength, to surrender our timelines and clever plans, to undergo a kind of inner circumcision of the heart. James 4:7 whispers the hidden path to overcoming: submit to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. It's submission first, then resistance, consecration before conquest, obedience before occupation. So before God gave them victory over Jericho's mighty walls, He first dealt with what was uncut, unresolved, unfinished within them. Doesn't that reach into your own journey too? Could it be that before you see enemies topple in front of you, God wants to perform a quiet, private victory inside you, cutting away yesterday's chains so you can walk fully into tomorrow's promise? In conclusion, Moses was gone, but God most certainly was not. The wilderness had drawn its final breath, closing a long, dusty chapter written by miracles, murmurs, and manna. Yet, just beyond those familiar sands, the gentle current of the Jordan opened a brand new scroll, inviting God's people to write history upon promised soil. And right there, in that fragile, holy space between endings and beginnings, we discover something extraordinary. God's promises are never sealed away inside a prophet's tomb. They are carried forward by human hearts willing to say yes, hearts that choose obedience over hesitation, courage over fear, faith over sight. Deuteronomy 34:10 looks back with awe. But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Yes, Moses was utterly unique. His shadow stretched across Israel's memories like a towering cedar. But notice what didn't happen. Heaven did not fall silent at his passing. Angels did not wring their hands in uncertainty. In fact, Moses' departure only activated a greater unfolding of God's relentless plan. Can you see it? Moses' silhouette fading into the brightening horizon, his staff perhaps still faintly glowing with past wonders. Then there is Joshua, stepping humbly yet resolutely to the front of the people, the Ark of the Covenant blazing with holy light as it leads the way. Behind them, Israel crosses the parted waters of the Jordan, sandals pressing into ground that had waited centuries for their arrival. And beyond, rising in the distance like a dark promise, stands Jericho, its fortified walls unaware that their final days have already been written by the hand of God. Each of the 7 shocking events we've explored doesn't just recount ancient marvels. They whisper deeper truths that cross time to reach into your own life right now. Look closely. God prepares successors. He doesn't leave leadership to human guessing or fragile chance. Joshua wasn't a random pick from the crowd. He was readied in secret places, proven in hidden tests. Could God be preparing you in quiet seasons you've mistaken for delays? God never pauses his plan. The world may stand still under the weight of grief. You may feel paralyzed by loss or the ache of transition, but heaven's purposes roll forward like a river that cannot be dammed. Where we build altars to mourn, God often lays stepping stones to move on. God elevates the obedient. Joshua was not the strongest by natural standards. He didn't boast royal blood or the thunderous voice of a prophet, but he was faithful, and God always lifts the obedient, because surrendered hearts become vessels through which heaven pours its greatest works. God leads with power, from rivers that rise up in heaps to walls that later crumble under a shout. God's miracles validate his messengers. Have you ever wondered if the Red Sea and the Jordan weren't just about delivering Israel, but about stamping God's authority across their destiny? God fights for his people. The commander of the Lord's army didn't stroll into Joshua's camp asking politely if he might assist. He took command of the battlefield because it was already his. The same is true for the struggles that terrify you most. 2 Chronicles 20:15 still rings with eternal certainty. Do not be afraid nor dismayed, for the battle is not yours, but God's. And Romans 8:31 shouts it from eternity's battlements. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Friend, this isn't just a beautifully woven history lesson. This is a message straight for your season. Are you standing somewhere between yesterday's losses and tomorrow's unknowns? Are you grieving what feels like the end of something irreplaceable? The Moses figures in your life who once led you, inspired you, or prayed you through. Then hear this clearly. God hasn't stopped. In fact, he's only getting started. Moses may have departed from your life in some form, but Joshua is already rising. New assignments are unfolding. Fresh promises are waiting to be seized, and God's purposes are advancing with or without our cautious permission. So the question that hovers over this entire story, the question that leans over your own heart right now, is beautifully simple. Will you move forward with him? Will you step into the Jordan even before it parts? Trust his voice even when you feel least ready, and let him carve away whatever needs to be left in the wilderness so that you can fully possess your promised land. Because the God who split seas, rivers, and hearts wide open still writes stories through ordinary people who dare to say yes. And he is writing yours even now. And so we come to the end of this extraordinary journey through the 7 terrifying things that immediately happened when Moses died. Who would have thought that the final breath of one man could unleash such a breathtaking sequence of divine events? Rivers parted, armies were positioned, sacred covenants were renewed, all revealing a truth that has echoed through every generation since. Moses was gone, but God was not. Heaven does not halt when even the greatest of its servants fade from view. Instead, God's unstoppable purpose surges forward, proving that his promises are never buried in human graves. They live on, carried by hearts willing to trust and obey. Let this truth reach into the tender places of your own life. Maybe right now you stand in a season of endings, a wilderness chapter closing behind you, a Moses figure gone, whether it's a mentor, a relationship, an opportunity, or even a part of yourself that once led you with confidence. It might feel like everything should pause under the weight of loss or uncertainty. But the story of Joshua and Israel tells us something profoundly hopeful. God's plans don't falter when people or seasons change. In fact, that's often when they unfold most powerfully. He prepares successors long before we realize it. He parts new rivers when we fear we're stranded. He shifts from daily manna to harvest fields to grow us up into deeper trust. He asks for consecration, sometimes painful, because before victory over enemies around us, he wants victory inside us. And in it all, he reminds us that it's never been about human strength or clever strategy. It's always been about his Spirit, his covenant, and his glory. So wherever you find yourself today, on the edge of your own Jordan, longing for a promised land, yet still bearing wilderness dust on your feet, hear this: God hasn't stopped. He's only just beginning. Moses may be gone in your life, but Joshua is rising. The commander of heaven's armies is still taking the lead, and the story is moving forward with or without our cautious permission. And oh, what peace there is in knowing that the battles ahead belong first to Him. If this message stirred something in your heart, I'd love for you to let me know in the comments. Maybe write 777 as your personal sign of saying, Lord, I trust you to carry me into my next chapter. And if you found value or hope here, please like this video, subscribe for more powerful biblical revelations, and share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Thank you so much for spending your precious time here, for every comment, every share, and every generous super thanks donation that helps keep this message going. Whether you give financially or simply give by watching and engaging, know that it means more than words can express. I truly pray that the Lord blesses you and keeps you, that He shines His face upon you and gives you peace beyond understanding. May He lead you boldly into your promised land, rolling away every reproach of the past, strengthening you for every step ahead, and proving once again that His plans for you are far from over. They are only just beginning.